Hi, I'm Paul Salem from the Middle East Institute. We're here today with Dr. Gonul Tol, Director of the Turkey Program at the Middle East Institute, to talk about the great momentous developments in Turkey in the last few weeks and to get, Gonul, your views. Obviously, you follow Turkey very closely. You're from there. And I want to take you back to an article you wrote in the beginning of June of this year called Turkey's Next Military Coup, as if predicting that something like this would happen. At the start, could you sort of take us through how we got here? How did this happen? Why did this happen?
Unlike past coups, Turkey is a country who's experienced several coups, 4 successful coups, successful quote unquote. But if you look at past coups in 1960, 1972, and 1980, and finally 1997, you'll see that this was a different type of coup. This was very atypical in the sense that before, when the military decided to intervene in politics, there was public support for that. So in 1960, for instance, the people were on the street demanding military to intervene. There was chaos, institutions were not working, and the government was not really functioning well. So that was the context in which the military decided to intervene. And usually the justification for the intervention was the military always said that we are here to restore democracy. We have a government that is not functioning well, that is not really responding to the needs of the people. And usually the governments that the military was against, they were considered anti-secular and destroying Atatürk's republican democracy. So that was the main...
Sorry, let me actually ask about that. I mean, many people look at this coup and it's confusing as to whether the military did it in the old traditional Turkish sense, or according to sort of accusations from the government that it was a movement, the Gülenist movement, that had infiltrated the army. So could you unpack sort of the army situation? Clearly some were in the coup and some weren't.
Today, actually, Turkish armed forces released the number of people who were involved in the coup. So the government's narrative is this was purely a Gülenist movement, a Gülenist faction within the military, and there are reportedly 8,000 people involved in the coup.
Out of
that's probably around 1.52% of the whole military personnel. So the government says it was a purely Gülen faction within the military, but I believe it was a larger coalition. So unlike past coups, where it was always the Kemalist establishment that was involved in the coup, this was a Gülenist-led coup, and that's what makes it different from past coups.
So was this coup planned to happen at this time? I mean, there was the impression that it was a botched coup, a coup that didn't work very well. As you said, the previous coups were quote-unquote successful, at least that the coup was a full coup. What happened? Was this a poorly planned coup or a rushed coup?
It was a rushed coup, but I don't think it was a poorly planned coup. And as an answer to your first question, very few people expected this, because many people thought that President Erdogan and the government was in full control of the military. After the AKP came to power, they passed several reforms, and finally the military's influence in politics was curbed. So everyone thought that Erdogan was in charge and the military was fully under control. But what I was saying in that article, June article, was that in fact that wasn't the case. The military still held considerable institutional autonomy, and a military intervention was not totally
out of the
question. So that's why it was not many people were expecting this.
Well, if it was at least partly linked to the Gülenist movement, tell our audience a bit what the background to it is, and why were things coming to such an extreme head that perhaps the Gülenists felt this, last-ditch effort, they have to try to stage a coup. What was happening there, and does it have anything to do with what was happening regionally? There's war with the Kurds, there's issues in the region that certainly the army high command cares about. What was it about this moment in Turkey's recent history that made these conditions so acute?
So it was a power struggle. Again, unlike the past coups, I think the main motivation here was not to restore democracy, but this was a power struggle within the Islamist camp. So the ruling AKP and the Gülenist movement, they were former allies, but there was a rift between the two starting from 2013. And because of the AKP, I think the AKP we always talk about how the Gülenists infiltrated the state institutions. Yes, they have since 1980s, but starting from the AKP rule in 2002, they were actually invited in. So they held key positions in state institutions and state bureaucracy, including the military. So this was part of a general agenda of the government because they did not have their own human resources. So the Gülenists ended up replacing the Kemalists, the old establishment, in major state institutions. So I think this was a power struggle. After 2013, there was a corruption case that was launched by Gülenist judges against Erdogan and his close circle and his family. And that's when the war between the two started. And after 2013, the ruling party started going after the Gülenists in an effort to cleanse all state institutions of the Gülenist influence.
Well, let me ask the question. I mean, a lot of people were surprised by the speed with which, right after the coup was stopped or failed, the government had such extensive lists of judges and army officers and from all sectors of society, including journalists and others, detailed lists of people it wanted to purge and apparently is purging in a certain sense. Would you say that sort of the coup was in anticipation of a purge that was going to happen, so they said this is a last-ditch effort? Or to what degree did the coup create sort of fresh conditions and a new reality? Or maybe it's a bit of both. How do you see that dynamic?
No, certainly. I mean, there's usually every August the military holds this very important meeting where promotions are decided. So there were many. This was again part of the government's effort to cleanse the military, especially the military of the Gülenists. So in August, the decisions were going to be made, and all Gülenist officers were going to be removed. And reportedly, that's what led to the coup attempt. But that was not the only motivation. This has been a larger effort by the government, and that was a reaction to what Erdogan and his ruling party was doing to the Gülen movement. And I think moving forward, yes, there have been, I think, around 30,000 people. They've been sacked, they've been suspended. So if you look at all major institutions that are very important for Turkey's national security, the police force, intelligence, military, Ministry of Interior, thousands of people, they've lost their jobs. So this is a major attempt by the government to finally put an end to Gülen influence in these institutions. But I'm afraid this is not just going after the Gülenists, but also targeting the larger anti-Erdogan opposition as well.
Yeah, that's what I also maybe wanted to ask about. This is a moment that Turks lived through, and it was sort of three moments at once. A coup that was supposedly trying to stop Erdogan and the AKP party. There were some people who thought he was going too far. There was then another, at the same time, people coming out in defense of democracy in general against any coup on principle, and that was a moment in a way of unity and public empowerment. And the third dynamic was sort of, you might call it the counter-revolution or the counter-coup, where Erdogan and the AKP taking advantage of the situation to purge, as you said, maybe a broader cross-section. Before analyzing where we're going, how was this experienced in sort of the Turkish body politic, these sort of three things happening at once?
It's a huge trauma. Even if you talk to people, if you read Turkish media has never been great in terms of being objective, but even if you look at opposition newspapers, you'll realize the sense of trauma that the country is going through. Everyone is in this mood that this is a traumatic moment. This is a very important moment for us. So we have to unite. So this is not a good time to criticize the government, to criticize the police force. So there is that sense, and also paranoia. There are also those who are extremely concerned about where the country is headed, because many still think that yes, people united, pro-AKP and anti-AKP people united against the coup, which is wonderful. wonderful news for Turkish democracy. Yes, and the coup might have been prevented, but unfortunately, this doesn't mean that Turkish democracy won. So there are still those people who have been feeling marginalized under this party, that the government is capturing this moment to advance its own agenda and further victimize the opposition, the anti-Erdogan opposition. So I think people's feelings, they are mixed. But I think the overall atmosphere in the country is we are going through a historic time, and this is going to change major things in Turkish domestic politics, in Turkey's foreign policy, and the way how people view Turkish military. So this is a very important moment for Turkey.
Where do you think President Erdogan will go? I mean, what are the steps he will take? Maybe where are we now? What is the extent of the purge or the arrests? How deep is it going? And what steps do you think he will take moving forward? Obviously, the issue of a referendum to establish a more presidential constitution has been on the table for some time. The question of how he's dealing with the various opposition groups, which, as you said, supported opposition to the coup or came out against the coup, which is welcome news for the body politic. Will that encourage him to include them a bit more, to reach out to them, or will he be more sort of authoritarian in a narrow sense? How do you see his decision making going forward?
I think initially he really appreciated the opposition party's support for the elected government. I think both the main opposition party, CHP, and the ultra-nationalist party and the pro-Kurdish party, they reacted the way that really respected democratic freedoms, and they were very anti-coup. And I think Erdogan and the ruling party appreciated that. So in an effort to show his appreciation, he invited them and they held meetings and he thanked them. So this gave us hope. But on the other hand, the pro-Kurdish party wasn't invited to the talks, which is concerning because this was, the country is fighting several wars. There is a fighting going on between the state and the PKK. Obviously, there is the ISIS threat, and now all institutions, Turkish institutions, are crumbling, and you see that paranoia in the country. So this is a very difficult time, and you would expect the leader of the country to bring people together. And I think the pro-Kurdish party did its part, condemned the coup, and held several public meetings, asking its supporters to go out on the streets protesting the coup. So they did their part, but I think unfortunately the president didn't do his part in terms of engaging them, and that's really not good news. Although today the main opposition party leader asked President Erdogan whether he was considering including the pro-Kurdish party as well in the dialogue, and his response was promising. He wasn't quite clear, but he said, yes, we'll do our best moving forward. So if that happens, maybe that could be the silver lining, I think, in all this.
Well, let's pull back a bit and see, how this may or may not affect the president's or Turkey's regional foreign policy to start with, but also internationally. Do you see any direct impact on the two things you mentioned? Obviously, the Kurdish question in northern Syria and things happening with Syria there, and the Kurdish question internally, and at the same time, the question of the war on ISIS. The Incirlik air base the commander was apparently arrested, and there's accusations that there was involvement there. How do you see sort of the Syria-Iraq war on ISIS policy being impacted?
I think the anti-ISIS fight against the Islamic State is certainly going to be impacted, because if you look at the generals who've been arrested, they are the ones who have been leading the fight against both the PKK and the Islamic State. And in fact, one of the generals who is allegedly the mastermind of the failed coup attempt, he was praised for his efforts by the government a month ago, because he's been doing a great job in terms of fighting against ISIS and the PKK. And also, so that is one part of the picture, but also the fact that there are so many people who have been arrested or fired, who are working for the police force or the military or even the intelligence. I think, again, we're talking about the crumbling of all institutions, and that will have a huge impact on Turkey's fight against the Islamic State. I remember the former chief of staff talking to one of the Turkish news channels right after the coup, saying that in 2011, in 2010, when there were arrests of Kemalist military officers for their alleged involvement in a coup plot against the government, hundreds of people from Turkish military, they've been fired or they've been sent to jail. And he said it took 5 years for the military to replace those people. And we're only talking about hundreds. So now thousands of them have been arrested. So that means that it would really take a long time for the Turkish military to rebuild the institution. And that will deal a blow to Turkey's efforts to fight the Islamic State. And another factor, I think, is Turkish intelligence will be it will be focusing on the Gülen movement instead of ISIS or the PKK. So I think these are the things that will impact Turkey's policy in Syria and Turkey's cooperation with the US. With regard to, I think, the Kurds, it all depends on what Erdogan's plans are in terms of going back to the negotiations with the Kurds. The initial signs, as I mentioned, the fact that he did not invite the pro-Kurdish party to the meetings and he didn't really engage them, is not a good sign. And I think another bad sign is the government imposed a state of emergency rule for 3 months, but history has shown us that they can be extended. Yeah. The last one that was imposed in 1987 ended only in 2002. So if that happens, it's very difficult to talk about granting or talking about granting more rights to Kurds in an environment where there is a state of emergency. So I'm not very optimistic about the government's plans to go back to the negotiations with the Kurds, and that will directly impact Turkey's Syria policy.
Okay, well, on a sort of a final scale, if you pull back a bit further and look at Turkey's relations with sort of Russia, EU, and the United States, there may be a resurgence, maybe of relations with Russia. How is that developing? Is that anything connected to what happened in the coup? Europe and the US, are blamed, at least the US is blamed, directly or indirectly. We'll get to the US in a moment. But what could you say about sort of Erdogan's global relations, Russia, Europe, and the US initially, right after, in this moment?
Right before the coup attempt, Turkey had embarked on normalization with Russia, and I think that process will move forward. And especially now that the pilot who shot down the Russian jet is accused of being part of the coup plotters. So Turkey is now blaming that pilot for downing the Russian jet. And I think, again, this is a time for Erdogan. He's feeling very vulnerable and very marginalized in the region. Vulnerable domestically, marginalized globally and regionally. So I think he will continue. He will move forward with normalization with Russia, and Russia is open to that.
What could they agree on? They disagree over many things in Syria, obviously. Where are areas of agreement, and how significant would that be for Erdogan or for Turkey?
For the main problem for Turkey was, of course, Russia's very pro-Assad stance, and also their support for the Kurds. They've been cooperating with the Syrian Kurds. So those were two main problems in Turkey's relations with Russia. But I think Turkey is now at a point where it has realized that it has to recalibrate its approach to Assad. For a long time, it resisted calls to change its Assad policy and said there is no place for Assad in a transition government. I think Turkey will be forced to change that approach now that everyone is on board and their main focus is fighting the Islamic State, and very few people are concerned about the fate of the regime. So I think Turkey has come to realize that Americans also, they're closer to Russia's approach, so it feels very marginalized in Syria, and that's why I think it might be forced to recalibrate its approach to Assad, which will make things easier with Russia. And on the other hand, the PYD, or the Syrian Kurdish question, Russia, they provided weapons to the Syrian Kurds, working very closely. They even opened an office in Moscow, and that really bothered Turkey. So I think after this normalization, both can cut a deal on that, which will again make the normalization a lot easier.
And on Europe, before ending on the US, I mean, there were obviously issues about refugees before all of this happened. Has the European question vis-a-vis Turkey been impacted by the coup, the counter coup?
It might be, especially if Turkey re-establishes the death penalty, which now the government has been talking about that, and that disqualifies Turkey from EU membership. That would be a huge problem. And also, I think the European countries, they've been more vocal in their criticism of Erdogan's response to the coup. I mean, all the measures that he has taken are seen by the European governments as an attempt to capture more power. And that's why they've been very critical. And that's why we've seen this rise of anti-Western sentiment in Turkey. So that could be a problem. But at the end of the day, I think European Union still needs to work with Turkey, both in the fight against Islamic State and also on the refugee question.
So they'll work it out.
Yes, they will. They will have
there's no
to.
membership anyway for the time being.
Yes.
Finally, on the U.S., I mean, obviously there was accusations from the government that maybe the U.S. was even behind some of this. There was a lot of drama around the Incirlik air base, and there's demands to extradite Fethullah Gulen. Where do you see Turkish-U.S. relations now and going in the next few months before the next election?
Of course, now it's very tense because almost on a daily basis we hear government officials, they blame the U.S. And even one minister said that the U.S. was behind the coup because there were military units operating out of Incirlik air base that were involved in the coup attempt, and that's not helping. Especially Pentagon is really worried about the developments because they really have to work with Turkey. And another concern on the U.S. side is how is Turkey going to fight against the Islamic State when it is turning increasingly inward, working on its own problems, and with all these institutions being ineffective, the military, the police force, the intelligence. So from the US perspective, what is happening in Turkey is extremely concerning purely from the anti-ISIS fight, the anti-ISIS coalition perspective. From the Turkish perspective, the main focus is extradition of Fethullah Gülen.
And how might that evolve? I mean,
it's going to be very difficult for several reasons. First, I think the Turkish government has to understand that this is a legal process. Yes, Secretary Kerry at the end of the day has to sign the extradition, but there's rule of law in this country, so this is a legal decision before it is political. But Turkey doesn't. It feels obviously very strongly about that, and it's been asking Washington to extradite Gülen for some time now. But until now, they never had the hard evidence that the U.S. has been asking for. So now the Turkish government says that it finally has. But I think the challenge is going to be, I think from the U.S. perspective, from the U.S. legal perspective, how are you going to link Fethullah Gülen himself to the coup attempt? That finding that hard evidence is going to be very, very difficult. This is a very secretive organization. So for that to happen, the Turkish side has to prove that Fethullah Gülen was the one who made
Himself,
the
yeah.
operational decision
Yeah,
making.
yeah.
He was involved.
So it'll definitely take an extent of time, at least. I mean,
Yes, and he's been here legally, so
yeah.
the question of whether they can deport to a third country or not, that is also challenging. So I think this will be the main issue, but Obama administration is nearing its end, so I think the Turkish government is just waiting for the next
Wait and
US
see.
administration.
Well, ending on that note, I mean that the Obama administration is nearing its end. President Erdogan, Prime Minister Erdogan dealt with President Obama over the last 7.5 years. What do you think the governments, or even Turkey, following this very dramatic election in the U.S. between Secretary Clinton and Donald Trump? Uh, what can you say about how Turks are seeing this, and perhaps how the government, would they be more comfortable with one or the other?
I think before the coup, the expectation was they've been very frustrated with the Obama administration. They thought that the Obama didn't do enough in Syria, so they were hoping that if Hillary Clinton becomes the president, things will be easier in terms of Turkey's Syria policy, because Clinton several times mentioned that she was open to the idea of establishing a no-fly zone in northern Syria, and that's been a demand that Turkey has had for several years. So I think the expectation is that the U.S. will play a more proactive role in Syria. The next U.S. president will play a more proactive role in Syria, and that's what Ankara has been waiting for. But it might get disappointed, I believe, because that option is still not very easy, establishing a no-fly zone.
So we're going from one traumatic event to another.
Yes, we are.
Well, Dr. Gonul Tol, thank you very much for being with us and for
Thank
sharing
you.
your views. We hope things develop positively in Turkey, very difficult times, and thank you all for following this discussion with us. I'm Paul Salem from the Middle East Institute.